Under the pale glow of a desert moon, a young heiress slipped away from the towering gates of her family's sprawling ranch. Her satin dress, torn at the edges, dragged through the dust of the trail as she fled into the arms of a man whose hands were scarred by fire and steel. He was a poor blacksmith, known in town only for his tireless labor and quiet strength, never for love or grandeur. Yet on that night, their paths collided in a way that would challenge not only their fates, but the rigid rules of the Wild West. The choice she made was not just a rebellion against wealth and power. It was a gamble with destiny itself. The blacksmith had no idea who she truly was when she came to him, cloaked in shadows, her eyes trembling with both fear and defiance. To him, she was only a mysterious woman seeking refuge from a life she could no longer bear. In his humble workshop, lit by the dim, orange glow of dying embers, he offered her shelter without asking questions, his heart stirred by a longing he could not name. What he didn't know was that her family's name carried weight heavier than iron, and the consequences of her escape could ignite a storm across the plains. As dawn began to spread its golden fingers over the horizon, the first truth revealed itself. He awoke to find her not in the rugged clothes of a wanderer, but adorned with silk and jewels hidden beneath a rough cloak. The poor blacksmith, a man who had spent his life forging horseshoes and wagon wheels, stood stunned before the heiress of one of the most feared and respected families of the territory. The gap between them stretched wider than the desert itself, and yet the spark in her eyes told him there was no turning back. The townsfolk whispered of scandal, of disgrace, of a love that could never endure the pressures of money and legacy. In saloons and dusty streets, her name was spoken with outrage, while his was spoken with pity. But love in the Wild West had never been about permission. It was born from risk, from blood and sweat, from the courage to defy what others deemed impossible. And so, while the world around them sharpened its knives, they clung to each other with a strength no wealth could buy. What neither of them realized, in that fragile beginning, was that her true identity was only the first of many secrets yet to surface. The dawn revealed her as an heiress, but the days ahead would uncover a story of betrayal, sacrifice, and redemption that would test every ounce of their devotion. It was not just a tale of forbidden love. It was the kind of story the old cowboys would carry into legend, told around fires where silence stretched long and hearts yearned for hope. The blacksmith's forge had always been a place of solitude, filled only with the hiss of hot iron meeting cool water and the ringing of steel against steel. Yet now, in the fragile silence after dawn, it carried a weight he had never known before. The woman who had stumbled into his life during the night was no longer just a fugitive cloaked in mystery. She was the daughter of a powerful cattle baron whose lands stretched farther than the eye could see. Her escape was not a simple act of defiance, but a direct challenge to an empire built on blood, wealth, and fear. The blacksmith, who had never sought trouble beyond the anvil, now found himself standing at the edge of a firestorm. Her presence unsettled him in ways he could not admit, not even to himself. He had seen the softness of her hands, unmarked by labor, and the glimmer of rings hidden beneath her cloak. He knew she did not belong to the dust and smoke of his workshop, yet there was a light in her eyes that whispered of freedom, of a desire stronger than the chains of heritage. The blacksmith had always believed that iron could be bent with enough heat, but watching her, he wondered if destiny itself could be reshaped by love and defiance. The town, however, was not blind. Strangers had seen her slip into his forge, and rumors began to spread like wildfire. By the time the morning sun rose high above the plains, whispers already filled the saloon, the general store, and the sheriff's office. Men spoke of the blacksmith's foolishness, daring to harbor the heiress, while others predicted her family's wrath would descend upon the town before the week was over. The air grew thick with unease, for the West was unforgiving to those who crossed the line between wealth and poverty. For the heiress, there was no turning back. She had lived too long in a gilded cage, where every smile was rehearsed and every step measured. With the blacksmith, she felt the rawness of life, the heat of fire, the smell of sweat and steel, the simplicity of hands that worked not for glory but for survival. These were things she had never touched, never understood, and yet longed for with all her heart. She saw in him not just a man, but a doorway to a life she had dreamed of in silence. Still, shadows loomed on the horizon. Her family's riders were known to scour the land like wolves when dishonor stained their name. The blacksmith, though strong, had no army, no wealth, and no allies to shield him. The plains themselves seemed to hold their breath, waiting to see whether love born in fire could withstand the storm that was about to break. The West had seen many romances wither under the weight of power, but few dared to rise against it. The following nights stretched longer than the days, each one thick with both tenderness and fear. The heiress would sit by the forge, her hands resting on her lap as she watched him shape metal with a strength that seemed eternal. She marveled at his silence, at the way he worked without complaint, as though the weight of life's burdens had already been hammered into his soul. To her, it was a kind of poetry, one forged not by ink, but by fire and sweat. Yet behind every quiet moment, they both felt the echo of hooves on the horizon, the coming storm they could not avoid. One evening, as the fire dimmed and the stars carved their path across the endless sky, she confessed fragments of her story. Her father had arranged her future like a business deal, promising her to a man twice her age in exchange for more land and political influence. Her heart had been caged in silence, her fate already signed without her voice. Running away had not been an act of impulse, but of survival, a desperate leap toward freedom before the chains locked forever. The blacksmith listened, his jaw tightening, for he knew that men like her father did not forgive betrayal. He had seen this kind of power before, though never so close to his own life. Ranchers who commanded armies of hired guns, who could silence towns with a single word, who believed that money was law and fear was justice. The heiress's confession was not just a plea for understanding. It was a warning of the storm that her presence carried. Yet as she spoke, the blacksmith felt a fire within him that no anvil had ever sparked. He realized he would rather face the wrath of an empire than surrender the fragile hope that now flickered between them. But love in the West was never a simple choice. Each day, new riders passed through town, some bearing the insignia of her family, others cloaked in shadows with eyes that lingered too long. The sheriff, though friendly in words, grew colder in gaze, as if weighing whether the law would serve justice or wealth. Even the townsfolk, once indifferent to the blacksmith's solitude, began to watch him with suspicion, their whispers laced with both envy and fear. The blacksmith's world, once small and predictable, was now a stage where every movement was judged, every silence questioned. Yet despite the gathering storm, their bond deepened. At dawn, when the world was quiet and only the forge's embers glowed, she would whisper words of courage, and he would answer not with promises but with steady presence. In those moments, it was as though the world beyond did not exist, as though the West itself had bowed to their defiance. But dawns do not last forever, and with each sunrise, the shadow of her true world drew nearer, ready to tear apart the fragile sanctuary they had built together. The third dawn arrived with a silence heavier than the two before. The blacksmith awoke to the sound of distant hooves, faint yet certain, rolling like thunder across the plains. He knew, without needing to look, that the hunt had begun. The heiress, still wrapped in the cloak that had hidden her identity on the first night, clutched it tighter, as if fabric alone could keep the truth at bay. In her eyes, fear wrestled with defiance. She had lived her whole life surrounded by power, yet never had she felt so vulnerable or so alive. The blacksmith stepped out into the pale light, scanning the horizon with the instincts of a man who had learned to survive by caution. The forge behind him had always been a fortress, its flames strong and loyal, but he knew iron could not shield against bullets or the rage of men who felt betrayed. Still, he carried himself with the same calm he brought to his work, for panic had no place in the West. He had taken her into his world, and now, whether he had wished it or not, he was bound to protect her. As the day stretched on, the town grew restless. A pair of riders wearing the crest of her family arrived at the saloon, their spurs striking the wooden floor like the ticking of a clock. They asked questions with sharp eyes, their voices calm but edged with steel. Some townsfolk pointed them toward the blacksmith shop. Others stayed silent out of fear. But all knew what was at stake. To shelter her was to defy one of the most powerful men in the territory. And the West did not forgive defiance easily. Inside the forge, the heiress paced like a bird trapped in a cage, her hands trembling not from weakness but from the weight of choice. She knew what her family's men were capable of. She had seen them bend others to her father's will, leaving trails of fear in their wake. She turned to the blacksmith with a whisper that was half plea, half vow. If harm came to him because of her, she could never forgive herself. Yet the blacksmith only shook his head, his voice steady. Iron breaks under doubt, but holds under fire. That night, as the moon rose high, their world narrowed to the glow of the forge. The embers burned like watchful eyes, and in their light, the blacksmith forged a piece not for trade, but for survival, a weapon of iron, simple yet unyielding. It was not wealth, nor legacy, nor power he sought to defend. It was her. In that moment, as sparks rained around them, she realized that love in the Wild West was not measured by promises or words, but by the courage to stand unshaken when the world came to tear it apart. The next morning, the town awoke to tension thick as gun smoke. Word spread quickly. More riders were coming, not 2 but 10, carrying the family's insignia like a banner of war. The sheriff, pressed between loyalty to the law and fear of the cattle baron's wrath, walked a fine line. He warned the blacksmith in hushed tones, surrender her quietly, and the storm would pass. But the blacksmith, steady as ever, met the sheriff's gaze and spoke only once. He would not hand her over. The sheriff left without another word, but the weight of that decision lingered in the air. The heiress watched this exchange from the shadows of the forge, her heart torn between gratitude and dread. Every choice the blacksmith made for her carved a deeper bond between them, yet also drew them closer to ruin. She had grown up surrounded by men who used power as a weapon, yet here was a man who used strength as a shield, not for himself, but for someone he had known only days. It was a kind of devotion she had never dreamed of, and it shook her to her very core. As the riders drew near, the town became a stage of silent judgment. Some pitied the blacksmith, already imagining his fall. Others envied him, for he had won the heart of a woman beyond reach. But all of them knew one truth. The West belonged not to dreamers, but to those willing to fight for their place. The saloon doors swung, dice rolled, but all eyes were fixed on the horizon, waiting for the clash that seemed inevitable. That evening, as the sun bled into the desert sky, she finally revealed the full truth. The man her father had chosen for her was not only twice her age, but a figure feared across the frontier, a man whose cruelty left scars wherever he walked. Her marriage was meant to seal an alliance of terror, one that would stretch her father's empire farther than ever before. By running, she had not only defied her father, but humiliated her future husband, a humiliation that would demand blood. The blacksmith listened, his silence harder than steel, knowing that this was no mere feud. It was a battle against men who lived for vengeance. That night, while the forge crackled and the stars hung heavy, they spoke little. Yet their silence was not empty. It was a vow. The blacksmith's world had been simple once, shaped by fire and iron. Now, it carried the weight of love, danger, and destiny. And though the storm gathered just beyond the town, the flame in the forge burned brighter than ever, as if daring the night itself to try and snuff it out. The following day carried with it a suffocating stillness, as though the land itself braced for a storm. The blacksmith hammered at the anvil, each strike echoing like a drumbeat of defiance across the empty street. Though his body moved with the rhythm of work, his mind was sharp and restless, weighing the dangers closing in. He had spent his life shaping metal for horses and wagons, never imagining he would stand against men born to power. Yet now every swing of the hammer felt like preparation for battle. The heiress watched him with quiet awe, torn between fear and admiration. She had never seen such unwavering resolve, never felt such safety in the presence of a man who owned nothing but his craft. Her world had been painted in gold and power, yet hollow at its core. His world was raw, simple, but carved with truth. In that forge, amid sparks and smoke, she felt more alive than in all her years surrounded by wealth. But love in the West was as fragile as glass, easily shattered by forces beyond one's control. By noon, The riders entered town. Dust trailed behind them, cloaking the horizon in a veil of dread. 10 men on horseback, faces hard as stone, eyes sharp with hunger for blood and obedience. They carried her family's crest, as though it were a brand of fear, daring anyone to oppose them. The townsfolk scattered, doors shut, windows shuttered, but behind every crack in the wall eyes watched, waiting to see whether the blacksmith would bow or break. They found him standing at the doorway of his forge, his figure framed by the glow of fire and smoke. He did not flinch, nor did he reach for a weapon. His silence was louder than their threats, a calm that unnerved men who thrived on fear. They demanded the heiress, their voices carrying the weight of her father's wrath. Yet before the blacksmith could answer, she stepped forward, her cloak falling from her shoulders, her voice trembling but clear. She declared her choice, her rebellion, her love, not as a girl hidden in silk, but as a woman ready to face the price of freedom. The riders sneered, some laughing at her courage, others tightening their grip on their rifles. The West had no mercy for defiance, especially not from a woman born into privilege. But in that moment, as her words hung in the air, the blacksmith's eyes burned with a fire no forge could contain. If war was what they brought, then war was what they would find. For love in the Wild West was not a gentle story. It was a battle carved into the dust, where only the fearless could endure. That night, tension gripped the town like chains. The riders lingered in the saloon, their presence heavy and threatening, drinking as though they already owned the land. The sheriff avoided the blacksmith's forge, unwilling to take sides openly, though his silence was as clear as betrayal. The townsfolk whispered behind closed doors, predicting death before dawn, yet none dared to intervene. The heiress sat in the forge, her heart racing with every sound outside, knowing that her choice had set the entire town on edge. The blacksmith sharpened his tools, not for trade but for survival. His hands, steady as ever, moved across steel with precision, crafting pieces that could serve as both defense and warning. He was no outlaw, no gunslinger famed across territories, yet in his silence lay a strength that frightened even the shadows. The heiress watched him, realizing that his courage did not come from skill with weapons, but from a heart unwilling to yield. It was this strength, unpolished yet unbreakable, that drew her closer than any riches ever could. As midnight approached, she confessed her deepest fear. It was not death, nor her father's wrath, but the thought of dragging him into a war that was not his. Her voice cracked as she told him she would leave if it meant saving his life, vanishing into the desert before her pursuers could strike. The blacksmith paused, his hands still upon the steel, then turned to her with eyes as steady as the anvil itself. He told her that iron, once shaped, could not return to ore, and neither could his heart return to the emptiness before she came. The moon cast silver light through the forge's cracks, illuminating their faces, as though the heavens themselves bore witness to their vow. Outside, boots scraped against dirt, spurs rattled, laughter spilled from the saloon, signs of the enemy waiting for dawn. Yet inside the forge, time seemed to still. The flames whispered, the steel glowed, and in the quiet between them, love became a shield stronger than any weapon. When the first coyote's howl pierced the desert night, the blacksmith rose, his hammer in hand. He was no soldier, no nobleman, but in that moment he stood as something greater, a man ready to challenge the very order of the West. And as the heiress's fingers intertwined with his, both knew the morning would decide not only their fate, but whether love could truly defy the weight of power, blood, and legacy. The dawn broke with a crimson sky, as though the heavens themselves foresaw the blood that might stain the earth before the day's end. The riders emerged from the saloon one by one, their boots striking the wooden boards with calculated menace, their horses stamping restlessly, as if sensing the storm ahead. They formed a line along the main street, their eyes fixed on the forge. The town held its breath, the silence broken only by the creak of leather and the distant cry of a raven circling above. Inside, the heiress clung to the blacksmith's arm, her voice trembling as she urged him to let her go. She argued that her father's wrath was hers to face alone, that she had no right to drag him into ruin. But the blacksmith only placed his rough, soot-stained hand gently over hers. His voice was steady, low, and unyielding. A man who had been iron knew that sometimes the hardest metal was not forged by fire but by choice. He would not abandon her, no matter the cost. When he stepped into the open, the forge's glow still burning behind him, the riders shifted uneasily. His presence carried no banners, no wealth, no army. Only the raw defiance of a man who stood where no one else dared. The leader of the riders, a scarred man with eyes like cold steel, sneered and spat into the dust, demanding the heiress at once. His voice rang across the street, promising mercy if she was surrendered, death if she was not. The blacksmith's answer was silence, a silence that roared louder than any threat. He gripped the hammer at his side, not as a weapon, but as a symbol of the fire he had built his life upon, of the love he now swore to protect. The heiress then stepped beside him, her voice clear and fearless, declaring before all that she had chosen her own path. The riders laughed, mocking the sight of a woman defying her father's empire, yet there was a flicker of hesitation in their eyes. For in that moment, they were not facing wealth or power, but something far more dangerous, conviction. The standoff stretched into eternity. Dust swirled around their boots. The morning sun seared the air, and still no one moved. The West was built on moments like this, where silence held more weight than bullets, where the measure of a man was taken not by words, but by the steadiness of his stance. And as the town watched from behind shuttered windows, they realized they were witnessing not just defiance, but the birth of a legend. The riders struck first, not with bullets, but with intimidation. They dismounted, their spurs ringing like the toll of a bell, surrounding the forge as if to choke the life from it. The scarred leader stepped closer, his hand resting on the grip of his revolver, his lips curling into a smile devoid of warmth. He warned the blacksmith that his defiance would bring more than death. It would bring ruin upon the town, famine upon the ranchers, fire upon the very ground they walked. It was not just a threat. It was a promise forged in cruelty. The blacksmith listened, his jaw set, his silence unbroken. He had known hardship all his life, had seen hunger gnaw at men's pride and storms strip the land bare. Fear had never built him, and fear would not break him now. When he finally spoke, his words were few, but each struck like a hammer on steel. The forge was his, the woman was free, and no man, not even kings of cattle, would take either from him. The leader's hand twitched, his revolver flashing in the sun. Yet before steel could meet air, the heiress stepped forward. With fire in her voice, she named herself openly, declaring her lineage and denouncing the life her father had chosen for her. She told them she would rather die beside a poor blacksmith than live as a queen in chains. Her words rippled through the air, shaking even the hardened men who had come to drag her home. For in her defiance, they saw not weakness, but a spirit unbroken. Some of the riders faltered, their loyalty tested by the strength in her voice. They had followed her family for coin and power, yet here was a woman born into that very power, rejecting it with a courage they themselves had never dared. The leader, enraged by their hesitation, cursed them and raised his gun higher. But the blacksmith moved with the swiftness of fire striking steel, his hammer swinging upward, knocking the revolver from the man's grip before it could discharge. Sparks of defiance lit the dust-filled air. The street erupted in chaos. Men drew their weapons, the townsfolk gasped, and the silence of dawn shattered into the roar of conflict. Yet amidst the dust and clamor, one truth became clear. This was no longer a clash between power and poverty. It was the test of whether love and freedom could outshine fear in a land where only the ruthless were meant to survive. And as the blacksmith stood, hammer raised, the West itself seemed to lean forward, eager to see how the tale would unfold. The street turned into a storm of fists, steel, and dust. The blacksmith, though outnumbered, moved with the strength of a man forged by years of fire and labor. His hammer swung not with rage, but with purpose, each strike a vow to protect the woman who had entrusted him with her freedom. The riders, armed with revolvers and knives, found themselves rattled by the sheer will of a man they had dismissed as insignificant. He was no outlaw, no soldier, yet he fought with a resolve that eclipsed their wealth and training. The heiress, though shielded by the forge's doorway, refused to remain idle. With fierce determination, she grabbed a hot iron rod from the fire and struck it against the ground, its glow a warning that she too would fight. The sight of her standing defiant, silk torn and face streaked with soot, unsettled even the most hardened of the riders. She was no longer the girl they had been ordered to retrieve. She had become a flame no storm could easily extinguish. The clash rattled the town. Windows rattled, children cried, and yet not a single soul intervened. The people had seen enough bloodshed in their lives to know that destiny was unfolding, and none dared to stand in its way. From the shadows, they watched, hearts torn between fear and awe, as one man and one woman stood against the empire of cattle and coin. The leader, humiliated by the blacksmith's resistance, roared like a wounded beast. His revolver fired, the bullet grazing the blacksmith's shoulder, drawing blood but not slowing his stance. Pain surged through him, yet he gritted his teeth, raising the hammer high once more. For him, the wound was not a sign of weakness, but a mark of the price he was willing to pay. The forge inside him burned hotter than ever, fueled not by steel but by love. The battle stretched until the dust itself seemed to scream. And though the outcome remained uncertain, one truth had become clear. This was no ordinary fight. It was a war of two worlds, power against conviction, fear against freedom, legacy against love. And the West, merciless and vast, would decide which flame would endure. The riders regrouped, circling like wolves, their eyes burning with rage and disbelief. Never before had a poor craftsman dared stand against them with such defiance. Never had an heiress so openly rejected her bloodline. The scarred leader spat blood into the dust, his pride shattered more than his weapon, and swore that this fight would not end until the blacksmith lay dead at his feet. His words carried the venom of power scorned, echoing through the silent town like a death knell. But the blacksmith did not flinch. Blood ran down his arm. His breath came heavy, yet his stance was unbroken. He tightened his grip on the hammer, the symbol of his life's work, and locked eyes with the leader. In that gaze lay no fear, only the unshakable truth that he had chosen his side, and he would not turn back. The West respected many things, guns, money, power, but above them all, it respected courage. And in that moment, the blacksmith embodied it fully. The heiress stepped forward, her voice rising like a bell against the chaos. She declared before all that she was no longer her father's daughter, no longer the pawn of an empire built on fear. She was free, and her freedom was bound to the man who had chosen her without demand or condition. Her words cut sharper than any blade, stripping the riders of the certainty they had carried into town. For if power could be rejected by its own blood, what strength did it truly hold? A ripple of silence swept the street. Some of the riders lowered their weapons, their loyalty shaken. They had been hired with coin, bound by fear, but the fire in her voice stirred something buried deep within, the longing for freedom, for dignity, for a life beyond chains of gold. The leader cursed them as cowards, raising his revolver again, but even he could see the tide slipping through his fingers like sand. The blacksmith lifted his hammer once more, his eyes locked on the scarred man. The air was thick, the moment stretched thin as wire, and all who watched knew that what happened next would be told and retold in saloons, around campfires, and across the vast plains. For in the heart of the Wild West, legends were not born in peace. They were forged in fire, blood, and the unyielding courage to love when the world demanded surrender. The dust of that morning would never fully settle, for it carried with it the weight of a story greater than bullets and blood. The blacksmith, a man once known only for shaping metal, had become a symbol of defiance, proving that courage was not born from wealth or lineage, but from the unshakable will to stand firm in the face of power. The heiress, who had fled a life of chains, had found her voice in the forge's fire, and together they carved a truth that even the West could not ignore. Love, when chosen freely, is the fiercest rebellion of all. Their struggle was more than a battle against her father's empire. It was a challenge to the very order that ruled the frontier. In a land where money was law and fear was currency, they showed that the strength of one heart willing to risk everything could shatter the foundations of an empire. What began as whispers of scandal grew into echoes of legend, retold by ranchers, drifters, and townsfolk who found hope in a story that refused to bow to power. Yet, what lingers beyond the fight is not the clash of weapons, but the fire that burned within them both. A fire that asked one simple question: what is freedom worth to you? For some, it is measured in acres of land or gold stacked high. For others, it is the quiet right to love who they choose, to live unbound by fear. The West was unforgiving, but it was also a place where destiny bent to those bold enough to seize it. As the years passed, their names were spoken not as fugitives, but as symbols of choice. The blacksmith who stood with nothing but a hammer, and the heiress who defied a kingdom of cattle and coin. Their story remains a reminder that the lines drawn by society are never as strong as the bonds drawn by the heart. And perhaps that is the greatest truth the frontier ever gave, that even in the harshest lands, love can forge a future brighter than steel. If this tale stirred something in you, if it made you pause, reflect, or dream, let it not end here. Share your thoughts below, let your voice join the story, and keep this fire alive by subscribing for more journeys into the forgotten legends of the West. And if you found yourself walking beside them in spirit, do not forget to leave your mark with a like, so their courage echoes far beyond this screen. After all, stories like these live on only when hearts like yours choose to carry them forward.